Picture this, if you will. A dimly lit chamber within the stone walls of a medieval monastery. The year is 1347. A man lies strapped to a wooden table, his screams echoing through corridors where monks once chanted peaceful prayers. Above him stands a figure in robes, holding what appears to be a red-hot iron rod, glowing like a piece of fallen star. This is not a scene of punishment or persecution. This is medicine. Before we begin this journey into the darkest chapters of medical history, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Whether you're at home, commuting, or perhaps lying in a modern hospital bed, appreciating the comfort of contemporary healthcare. Take a moment to hit that subscribe button. You'll want to stay with us for stories that will make you grateful for every aspirin you've ever taken. Now, imagine for a moment that your worst hospital experience, perhaps a painful injection, an uncomfortable procedure, or even major surgery, was actually a luxury compared to what our ancestors endured. What if I told you that for over 1,000 years, the very people trusted to heal were often the architects of unimaginable suffering? That the line between medical treatment and outright torture was so thin it barely existed at all? Tonight, we'll explore the shocking truth about medieval medicine, where good intentions paved a road straight to hell, and where the phrase, "the cure is worse than the disease," took on meanings that would haunt humanity for centuries. We'll discover how learned men, guided by ancient texts and supernatural beliefs, created a medical system so brutal that death often seemed like mercy. This isn't just a tale of ignorance overcoming wisdom. It's the story of how fear, superstition, and desperation transformed healers into torturers, and patients into victims of practices so horrific they would make professional executioners pause in admiration. But this wasn't random cruelty. Every horrifying procedure we'll discuss tonight was performed with the sincere belief that it would help. Every scream that echoed through medieval chambers was, in the minds of those causing it, a necessary price for healing. That, perhaps, makes it even more terrifying. In the shadowed halls of medieval medicine, no practice was more revered, more trusted, or more utterly devastating than bloodletting. For over 2,000 years, this procedure formed the cornerstone of medical treatment across Europe, and its story reads like a chronicle of systematic human torture disguised as healing. The roots of this practice stretched back to ancient Greece, where physicians believed the human body contained 4 essential humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Any illness, they reasoned, resulted from an imbalance of these fluids. Blood, being the most visible and abundant, became the primary target for removal. What began as a logical-sounding theory would evolve into one of history's most deadly medical practices. By the medieval period, bloodletting had become so fundamental to medicine that it was practiced not just by physicians, but by barber surgeons who would trim your hair, pull your teeth, and drain your blood, all in the same visit. These men, identifiable by the red and white striped poles outside their shops, symbols that originally represented blood and bandages, operated with a casual efficiency that would be horrifying by today's standards. The instruments of bloodletting were themselves instruments of torture. The phleem, a spring-loaded device with multiple blades, would snap open to create parallel cuts across a patient's arm or leg. The scarificator, a brass contraption with gears and springs, would rapidly slash multiple wounds in a circular pattern. For those seeking a more gentle approach, there were the leeches, millions upon millions of them. In 1830s France alone, over 35 million leeches were imported annually for medical purposes. These creatures, each capable of consuming 10 times their own weight in blood, were applied not just to arms and legs, but to the most sensitive areas of the human body. Patients would endure dozens of leeches simultaneously, their skin turning into a writhing mass of blood-sucking parasites. But the true horror of bloodletting lay not in its methods, but in its scope. Medieval physicians believed that bloodletting could cure virtually everything: headaches, fevers, plague, epilepsy, madness, heartbreak, and even pregnancy complications. Charts were created showing which parts of the body should be bled according to astrological signs and phases of the moon. A patient might be bled from their temples for madness, from their ankles for gout, or from their neck for general ailments. The quantities of blood removed were staggering. Physicians would routinely drain between 20 to 40 ounces of blood in a single session, nearly a quarter of an adult's total blood volume. Some extreme cases saw patients losing up to 80% of their blood. The famous case of George Washington's final illness provides a chilling example. On December 14, 1799, Washington's doctors bled him 4 times in 8 hours, removing 40% of his blood. He died that same day, almost certainly from blood loss rather than his original throat infection. The psychological torture accompanying bloodletting was equally devastating. Patients were often strapped down or held in place by multiple assistants while cuts were made. Children as young as infants were subjected to bloodletting. Their tiny veins opened with the same ruthless efficiency as adults. The weak and elderly, those least able to survive significant blood loss, were often bled most aggressively, as physicians believed their corrupted blood needed the most thorough removal. Medieval bloodletting calendars specified not just when to bleed patients, but how much blood to remove based on their age, constitution, and the season. Spring bleeding was considered especially beneficial, as it would refresh the blood after winter's stagnation. Autumn bleeding would prepare the body for winter's challenges. These seasonal bloodlettings became community events, with entire villages participating in what amounted to mass medical torture. The tools of the trade evolved to become increasingly efficient at causing pain and extracting blood. The thumb lancet, designed to puncture the large veins in the thumb, was particularly agonizing. Used for headaches and mental conditions, would penetrate the delicate skin around the eyes and forehead. Arterial bleeding, the most dangerous form, involved puncturing major arteries in the neck or arms, often resulting in uncontrollable hemorrhaging. Perhaps most disturbing was the complete faith that both practitioners and patients placed in bloodletting. Medical texts of the period describe bloodletting as the most reliable and universal remedy available to physicians. Patients would request bloodletting for minor ailments, believing it would prevent more serious conditions. Pregnant women were routinely bled throughout their pregnancies, often weakening them so severely that both mother and child died during childbirth. The practice persisted despite mounting evidence of its dangers. Records from medieval hospitals show that patients subjected to aggressive bloodletting had dramatically higher mortality rates than those who received other treatments. Yet rather than questioning the practice, physicians blamed treatment failures on insufficient bloodletting or improper timing. But this was only the beginning of medieval medicine's assault on the human body. As devastating as bloodletting was, other practices made it seem almost merciful by comparison. If bloodletting represented medieval medicine's systematic assault on the circulatory system, then trepanation, the practice of drilling holes through the human skull, represented its direct attack on the brain itself. This procedure, which sounds like something from a horror film, was actually one of the most common surgical interventions of the medieval period, performed with a casual brutality that defies modern comprehension. The practice of trepanation dates back over 6,000 years, making it quite possibly the oldest surgical procedure known to humanity. Archaeological evidence reveals skulls from across the globe, from Peru to Scandinavia, from ancient Egypt to medieval France, all bearing the telltale circular holes that mark a trepanation. But it was during the medieval period that this practice reached truly horrifying levels of sophistication and frequency. Medieval physicians inherited their knowledge of trepanation from ancient Greek and Roman texts, particularly the writings of Hippocrates and Galen, who had described the procedure for treating skull fractures. However, medieval practitioners expanded its use far beyond emergency trauma surgery. In their hands, trepanation became a cure-all for conditions ranging from epilepsy and mental illness to simple headaches, and what they termed possession by evil spirits. The procedure itself was a masterpiece of calculated torture. The patient would be strapped to a wooden table or chair, often with a specialized device called a trepanation gimlet that held the head perfectly still. Multiple assistants would be required to restrain the patient, as no effective anesthesia existed. At best, patients might be given wine mixed with opium or mandragora, but these substances were expensive and often unavailable, leaving most patients to endure the procedure fully conscious. The surgeon would begin by shaving the scalp and marking the location for the hole. In many cases, these locations were chosen not based on medical evidence, but on mystical beliefs about where evil spirits might be trapped. The forehead was popular for treating madness, while holes near the temples were believed to cure epilepsy. The back of the skull was often targeted for treating what medieval physicians called melancholia, what we would now recognize as depression. Once the location was marked, the real horror would begin. Using a trepan, a cylindrical drill with sharp serrated edges, the surgeon would begin the slow, excruciating process of boring through the skull bone. This was not a quick procedure. Drilling through healthy skull bone could take anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, depending on the skill of the surgeon and the thickness of the bone. The sound alone must have been unbearable. The grinding, scraping noise of metal against bone, mixed with the patient's screams and the surgeon's instructions to his assistants. Medieval accounts describe patients losing consciousness from pain only to be revived with cold water or smelling salts so the procedure could continue. The goal was to keep the patient alive and aware throughout the entire ordeal. As the drill penetrated deeper, blood would flow freely from the wound, mixing with bone dust to create a gruesome paste. The surgeon had to be careful not to penetrate too deeply. Breaching the dura mater, the protective membrane around the brain, would almost certainly result in infection and death. Yet this delicate work was being performed without magnification, proper lighting, or any understanding of sterile technique. The instruments used for trepanation were themselves objects of terror. The basic trepan resembled a large corkscrew with cutting edges. More sophisticated versions included guides and stops to prevent penetration too deeply, but these were often unreliable. Some surgeons preferred a technique called scraping, where they would use abrasive instruments to slowly wear away the bone, a process that could take an entire day. Medieval surgical manuals describe the ideal trepanation hole as being roughly the size of a large coin, about 40 millimeters in diameter. But archaeological evidence suggests that many medieval trepanations were much larger, with some skulls showing holes large enough to accommodate a person's thumb. These massive openings would have required removing substantial portions of the protective skull bone, leaving the brain vulnerable to injury and infection. The reasons given for trepanation reveal the depth of medieval medical ignorance and superstition. Epileptic seizures were believed to be caused by demons trapped within the skull, and creating an opening would allow these evil spirits to escape. Mental illness was similarly attributed to supernatural causes, with physicians believing that madness resulted from corruption or possession that could be literally released through the skull. Headaches, even minor ones, were often treated with trepanation, particularly if they persisted for more than a few days. Medieval physicians believed that pressure within the skull caused head pain, and that creating an opening would provide immediate relief. While there is some truth to the concept of intracranial pressure, their crude methods often created more problems than they solved. Children were not spared from trepanation. Medieval medical texts describe the procedure being performed on infants and young children for conditions including what they called water on the brain, likely hydrocephalus, and various forms of developmental disorders. The mortality rate for pediatric trepanation was catastrophically high, with most children dying either during the procedure or from subsequent infections. Women underwent trepanation for conditions specific to medieval beliefs about female physiology. Hysteria, believed to be caused by the wandering womb affecting the brain, was commonly treated with skull drilling. Pregnant women experiencing complications were sometimes subjected to trepanation in the belief that it would ease their labor pains. The survival rates for medieval trepanation varied dramatically depending on the location, skill of the practitioner, and care provided afterward. Archaeological studies suggest that in some regions, up to 70% of patients survived the initial procedure, evidenced by bone regrowth around the trepanation holes. However, these statistics don't account for deaths from subsequent infections, which were extremely common given the complete absence of sterile technique. Postoperative care was virtually non-existent by modern standards. The open wound would be covered with whatever materials were available, often dirty cloth or animal skin. Infections were treated with various herbal concoctions or simply left to heal naturally. Many patients who initially survived the trepanation would die weeks or months later from brain abscesses or other complications. Perhaps most disturbing was the casual frequency with which trepanation was performed. Medieval surgical records suggest that any physician or barber surgeon worth his salt would perform dozens of trepanations each year. It had become such a routine procedure that specialized trepanation tools were as common in a medieval medical kit as scalpels are today. The psychological impact on both patients and their families was devastating. Imagine watching a loved one undergo this procedure, knowing that the cure might very well be worse than the disease. The sounds, the blood, the obvious agony, all endured in the desperate hope that boring a hole through someone's skull might restore their health or sanity. Yet somehow, this wasn't even the most horrifying practice in the medieval medical arsenal. As we'll discover, there were treatments that made trepanation seem almost humane by comparison. In the pantheon of medieval medical horrors, few practices were as immediately terrifying or as universally applied as cauterization, the deliberate burning of human flesh with red-hot instruments. This wasn't punishment or torture in the conventional sense. This was medicine, prescribed by learned physicians and performed in healing institutions across medieval Europe. The screams that echoed from these procedures weren't those of criminals or heretics, but of patients seeking relief from ailments that doctors believed could only be cured through controlled burning. The theoretical foundation of cauterization rested on ancient medical principles inherited from Greek and Roman physicians. The great Hippocrates himself had written about the healing properties of fire, stating that what medicines do not heal, the knife heals. What the knife does not heal, fire heals. What fire does not heal, that must be considered incurable. Medieval physicians took this advice quite literally, transforming controlled burning into one of their most frequently employed treatments. The instruments of cauterization were designed with terrifying efficiency. Cautery irons came in dozens of different shapes and sizes, each designed for specific parts of the human body. There were narrow probes for inserting into natural body openings, flat irons for large surface areas, and specialized shapes for following the contours of joints and limbs. These instruments would be heated in specially constructed furnaces until they glowed white-hot, then applied directly to human flesh with deliberate precision. The process of preparation was itself a form of psychological torture. Patients could hear the furnace being stoked, could see the irons being heated, could smell the metallic scent of superheated metal. They would be restrained, often tied down with ropes or leather straps, while assistants positioned them for optimal access to the treatment area. There was no anesthesia, no pain relief, beyond perhaps a stick to bite down on or a few swallows of wine. When the moment of treatment arrived, the sound was as horrifying as the sensation. The sizzle of flesh meeting red-hot iron, accompanied by the patient's screams and the acrid smell of burning human tissue, created a sensory experience that witnesses described as hellish. Medieval accounts describe patients losing consciousness from the pain, only to be revived so the treatment could continue on other parts of their body. The applications of cauterization were breathtakingly extensive. Physicians used it to treat what they believed were cold diseases, conditions thought to result from an excess of cold, wet humors in the body. This included arthritis, paralysis, certain skin conditions, and various internal disorders. The burning was thought to restore the proper balance of hot and cold within the patient's body. Headaches were commonly treated with cauterization of the temples or scalp. The physician would make a grid of burn marks across the patient's forehead, each one deep enough to destroy the skin and underlying tissue. The resulting scars would be permanent reminders of the treatment, often leaving patients disfigured for life. Medieval medical texts proudly describe techniques for creating the most effective burn patterns, as if they were discussing artistic decoration rather than the deliberate destruction of human tissue. Digestive problems led to cauterization of the abdomen and back. Physicians would create elaborate patterns of burns across the patient's torso, believing that the external application of fire would somehow heal internal ailments. The stomach, liver, and intestinal areas would be systematically burned in precise geometric patterns, often requiring multiple sessions as previous burns healed. Joint pain and arthritis were treated with what medieval physicians called firing, the application of red-hot irons directly to affected joints. Knees, elbows, shoulders, and wrists would be burned both on the surface and in some cases, through deliberate insertion of heated probes into the joint spaces themselves. Patients would often be left unable to move the affected limbs for weeks or months, assuming they survived the procedure at all. Perhaps most disturbing was the use of cauterization in treating mental illness and behavioral problems. Physicians believed that madness resulted from corrupted humors rising to the brain, and that strategic burning of the scalp could redirect these harmful fluids. Patients suffering from what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions would have patterns of burns systematically applied to their heads, faces, and necks. The technique varied depending on the desired depth of burn. For surface treatments, the hot iron would be applied briefly, creating what medieval physicians called first-degree burns. For deeper treatments, the iron would be held in place until it penetrated through the skin into the underlying muscle or even bone. Some procedures called for inserting heated probes directly into body cavities or wounds, causing internal burns that were impossible to see or treat properly. Children were not exempt from cauterization. Medieval medical texts describe the treatment of childhood illnesses through systematic burning, with special notes on how to restrain young patients during the procedure. Infants suffering from what were likely common childhood diseases would be subjected to cauterization of their tiny limbs, torsos, and even faces. Women faced particularly brutal applications of cauterization. Gynecological problems were routinely treated through burning of the external genitalia and insertion of heated instruments into the vagina and uterus. Breast conditions led to the systematic cauterization of breast tissue, often resulting in permanent disfigurement or the complete destruction of mammary glands. The aftercare for cauterization was almost as brutal as the procedure itself. The burns would be left open to drain the corrupted humors, meaning they were allowed to become infected as a matter of course. Pus and infected tissue were considered signs that the treatment was working, drawing out the illness from within the body. Patients would often develop massive infections that proved more deadly than their original conditions. Multiple sessions of cauterization were common. A patient might undergo treatment once a week for months, with new burns being created while previous ones were still healing. The cumulative effect was devastating. Patients would be covered in scar tissue, with areas of their body permanently disfigured or rendered non-functional. The psychological impact was equally severe. The constant pain, the anticipation of future treatments, and the visible disfigurement would often drive patients to despair. Medieval records describe patients begging to be allowed to die rather than undergo additional cauterization sessions. Yet, physicians viewed such pleas as evidence that the treatments were successfully driving out the disease. Some of the most heartbreaking cases involved treating epilepsy through cauterization. Patients suffering from seizures would be systematically burned across their entire body in an attempt to prevent future episodes. The stress and trauma of repeated burning often made seizures worse, leading physicians to prescribe even more aggressive cauterization in a vicious cycle of escalating torture. The instruments themselves evolved to become increasingly sophisticated tools of agony. Specialized cautery irons were developed with multiple points, allowing physicians to create several burns simultaneously. Others featured hollow centers that could be packed with burning coals, maintaining their heat for extended periods during lengthy procedures. Yet, even as we recoil from the horror of cauterization, we must remember that this was considered the height of medical sophistication. Physicians who were skilled at cauterization were highly sought after and well respected. Patients would travel great distances to receive treatment from masters of the burning iron, believing they were seeking the best medical care available. But the medieval medical arsenal contained practices that made even cauterization seem restrained. As we'll soon discover, there were devices and procedures that blurred the line between healing and torture, so completely that the distinction became meaningless. In the twisted world of medieval medicine, the boundary between therapeutic instruments and torture devices disappeared entirely. Many of the tools found in a medieval physician's kit were indistinguishable from those used in dungeons and execution chambers. Others were specifically designed for medical procedures, but inflicted suffering so extreme that their intended healing purpose seemed almost irrelevant. These devices represent perhaps the darkest chapter in the history of medicine, where good intentions and medical ignorance combined to create instruments of unimaginable agony. The rack, while primarily known as a torture device, found frequent use in medieval medical practice. Physicians adapted this stretching machine to treat what they believed were problems with the spine and limbs. Patients suffering from back pain, joint stiffness, or paralysis would be strapped to medical racks and systematically stretched until their bones dislocated and muscles tore. Medieval medical racks were often more sophisticated than their torture chamber counterparts. They featured precise adjustment mechanisms that allowed physicians to control exactly how much force was applied to different parts of the patient's body. Some included pulleys and weights that could maintain constant pressure for hours or even days. The breaking wheel, another device borrowed from the execution chamber, was modified for medical use in treating fractures and joint disorders. Patients with broken bones would be strapped to the wheel, which would then be rotated to manipulate the fracture site. The theory was that the circular motion would help bones heal in proper alignment. Medieval physicians described this as dynamic bone setting, considering it superior to simple splinting. Perhaps more disturbing were devices created specifically for medical purposes, but designed with a callous disregard for patient suffering. The pair of anguish, a device that could be inserted into body orifices and then expanded through a screw mechanism, was routinely used in medieval gynecology, supposedly to open blocked passages or realign displaced organs. The agony was indescribable, and the medical benefit was non-existent. Breast rippers, devices featuring multiple hooks and claws, were employed in the treatment of various breast conditions. Medieval physicians believed that many female ailments originated in the breasts and could be cured through aggressive manipulation or partial removal of breast tissue. The heretic's fork, a device featuring sharp points that would be positioned under the chin and chest, was adapted for medical use in treating throat and neck conditions. Patients with sore throats, swollen glands, or voice problems would have these devices applied to force their heads into specific positions, while other treatments were administered. The points would pierce the skin, creating wounds that physicians believed would drain corrupted humors from the affected areas. Skull crushers, devices designed to apply gradually increasing pressure to the head, were used in treating various mental conditions and severe headaches. The patient's head would be placed in the device, and pressure would be slowly increased until the skull began to deform. The Spanish donkey, a wedge-shaped device typically used for torture, found medical application in treating spinal conditions and what medieval physicians called riding ailments, problems they associated with horseback riding. This was believed to realign the spine and cure various back problems, though it more commonly resulted in severe internal injuries. Thumb screws and other crushing devices were routinely used in medieval dentistry and for treating hand and foot ailments. Patients with toothaches would have their thumbs or fingers placed in these devices and subjected to increasing pressure until they lost consciousness from pain. The theory was that the intense pain in the extremities would somehow override the dental pain for hand and foot problems. The affected digits would be systematically crushed to release trapped humors and restore proper function. Patients would be enclosed in metal caskets lined with short spikes that would puncture the skin without penetrating vital organs. They would be left in these devices for hours or days, while the multiple wounds supposedly drained disease from their bodies was used for treating mental illness and behavioral problems. Patients would be strapped into these chairs and subjected to various forms of controlled torture, while physicians observed their reactions and adjusted the treatments accordingly. The medical wheel was a sophisticated torture device disguised as a treatment table. Patients would be strapped to a large wheel that could be rotated in various directions while additional tortures were applied. This was believed to help with circulation problems and joint stiffness. The constant motion, combined with the restraints and often additional devices attached to the wheel, created a prolonged experience of disorientation and pain, or insertion of water under pressure into body cavities. These procedures were believed to cleanse the internal organs and restore the proper balance of bodily fluids. Many patients died from water intoxication, drowning, or internal injuries caused by the high-pressure water insertion. The Trepanation, a device for suspended torture, was used medically to treat paralysis and muscle weakness. Patients would have their arms tied behind their backs and be suspended by ropes attached to their wrists. Weights would be added to their feet to increase the stretching force. Physicians believed this would restore nerve function and muscle tone, though it more commonly resulted in permanent shoulder dislocation and nerve damage. Specialized gynecological torture devices were created for treating various female conditions. The speculum doloris, featuring multiple expanding arms lined with spikes, would be inserted into women and gradually opened to cause maximum internal damage. This was believed to treat various reproductive ailments by opening blocked passages and removing corrupted tissue. The device often caused massive internal injuries and frequently proved fatal. The medical application of these devices was always accompanied by elaborate theoretical justifications. Physicians would carefully document which devices to use for specific conditions, how long treatments should last, and what signs to look for to determine if the treatment was working. These weren't random acts of sadism, but systematic medical protocols that physicians genuinely believed would heal their patients. The psychological impact on patients was devastating. Many would arrive at medical facilities expecting healing and instead encounter devices and procedures that were indistinguishable from torture. The betrayal of trust, combined with the physical agony, often caused mental breakdowns that physicians would then treat with additional torturous procedures. Perhaps most disturbing was the casual acceptance of these practices. Medical students would be trained in the proper use of torture devices as standard parts of their education. Families would bring their loved ones to physicians specifically requesting treatment with these devices, believing they represented the most advanced medical care available. But even these horrifying devices pale in comparison to the systematic human experimentation that characterized medieval medicine. As we'll discover, the line between patient and test subject had not yet been invented. In the darkest corners of medieval medical practice lay a truth so disturbing that it challenges our understanding of healing itself: the systematic use of human beings as experimental subjects, conducted without consent, oversight, or ethical consideration. Medieval physicians, driven by curiosity and guided by theories rather than evidence, transformed their patients into unwilling participants in experiments that would make modern researchers recoil in horror. These weren't isolated incidents or the actions of rogue practitioners, but accepted medical practice that turned healing institutions into laboratories of human suffering. The concept of informed consent was entirely foreign to medieval medicine. Patients who sought treatment, particularly the poor, prisoners, or mentally ill, were considered to have surrendered their bodies to whatever procedures physicians deemed necessary. This created a perfect environment for medical experimentation, where doctors could test new theories, try untested treatments, and satisfy their curiosity about human anatomy and physiology without any external constraints. Medieval hospitals, particularly those attached to monasteries and universities, became centers for what we can only describe as systematic human experimentation. The Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, considered one of the most advanced medical institutions of its time, maintained detailed records of experimental procedures performed on patients who had no idea they were being used as test subjects. These records, when they survive, provide chilling evidence of the complete disregard for patient welfare that characterized medieval medical research. One of the most common forms of experimentation involved testing various poisons and their antidotes on patients. Medieval physicians were fascinated by toxicology, partly for its medical applications and partly for its potential use in warfare and political assassination. Patients suffering from various ailments would be deliberately poisoned with substances ranging from arsenic and mercury to exotic plant and animal toxins, then treated with various supposed antidotes, while physicians carefully documented the results. The administration of mercury, one of medieval medicine's favorite treatments, provides a particularly horrifying example of systematic human experimentation. Patients with skin conditions, syphilis, or mental illness would be given gradually increasing doses of mercury compounds. While physicians observed the effects, the symptoms of mercury poisoning, tremors, madness, organ failure, and eventual death were carefully documented as if they were part of the healing process rather than evidence of systematic poisoning. Anatomical experimentation on living patients was another regular practice. The prohibition against dissecting human corpses led some medieval physicians to perform anatomical investigations on living patients during surgical procedures. Patients undergoing surgery for one condition would find themselves subjected to additional cutting and exploration as physicians satisfied their curiosity about internal organ function and anatomical relationships. The practice of vivisection, surgical procedures performed on living subjects for research rather than treatment, was particularly common in studying reproductive anatomy. Women undergoing childbirth complications would be subjected to experimental surgical techniques that had never been tested, with physicians using the emergency situation as an opportunity to explore new approaches to cesarean sections, uterine repair, and other gynecological procedures. Medieval physicians were particularly interested in testing theories about pain and consciousness. Patients would be subjected to various forms of controlled torture, while physicians observed their reactions and documented what they believed to be the relationship between physical trauma and mental states. These experiments often involved systematically inflicting different types of pain, burning, cutting, crushing, piercing, while carefully noting the patient's responses. The study of circulation and blood flow led to horrifying experiments involving deliberate blood loss and circulation restriction. Patients would have major blood vessels tied off or severed, while physicians observed the effects on different parts of the body. Others would be bled to near death and then subjected to various treatments intended to restore circulation, creating cycles of controlled dying and revival that usually ended in actual death. Brain function experiments were conducted through various forms of head trauma and trepanation. Patients with head injuries would be subjected to additional trauma in different areas of the brain, while physicians observed changes in behavior, consciousness, and physical function. These experiments were often disguised as treatment for the original injury, but were clearly conducted primarily to satisfy medical curiosity about brain function. Pregnancy and childbirth provided numerous opportunities for experimentation. Pregnant women, particularly those from lower social classes, would be subjected to various experimental procedures designed to test theories about fetal development, labor progression, and maternal health. These experiments often involved deliberate induction of premature labor, artificial manipulation of fetal position, and testing of various substances on both mother and developing child. The treatment of mental illness became a playground for experimental torture. Patients with various mental conditions would be subjected to systematic combinations of physical trauma, sensory deprivation, and chemical treatments, while physicians documented changes in their mental state. These experiments were often continued for months or years, with patients serving as long-term test subjects for various theories about the relationship between physical and mental health. Medieval physicians were particularly interested in testing the limits of human survival. Patients would be subjected to controlled starvation, dehydration, sleep deprivation, and exposure to extreme temperatures while their condition was carefully monitored. These experiments were often justified as treatments for various conditions, but the detailed documentation suggests they were conducted primarily to satisfy scientific curiosity about human physiological limits. The use of exotic substances obtained through trade provided new opportunities for human experimentation. Physicians would test various imported plants, animal products, and minerals on patients without any understanding of their effects or appropriate dosages. Patients became unwilling subjects in testing everything from rare spices and herbs to crushed pearls and powdered animal organs. Surgical experimentation was perhaps the most immediately dangerous form of medieval human research. Physicians would attempt new surgical techniques on patients who had come for treatment of relatively minor conditions. What began as treatment for a simple abscess might become an experimental exploration of surgical approaches to internal organ access, with the patient serving as an unwilling test subject for procedures that had never been attempted before. The documentation of these experiments reveals the cold, calculating nature of medieval medical research. Physicians would maintain detailed records of experimental procedures, noting which approaches were successful, meaning the patient survived, and which were not. These records show no evidence of concern for patient suffering or ethical consideration of the experimental nature of the treatments. Children were particularly vulnerable to medical experimentation. Orphans and children from poor families would be used to test pediatric applications of various treatments and procedures. The smaller size and developing physiology of children provided opportunities to test theories about growth, development, and the effects of various medical interventions on the developing human body. The combination of medical experimentation with other forms of torture was common in treating prisoners and criminals. These individuals, already condemned by society, became perfect subjects for the most dangerous and painful experimental procedures. Physicians would use the pretext of treating injuries sustained during torture or execution to conduct various anatomical and physiological experiments. The most disturbing aspect of medieval human experimentation was its systematic nature. This wasn't random cruelty or occasional lapses in judgment, but organized medical research conducted according to established protocols. Universities would maintain experimental subjects for extended periods, subjecting them to repeated procedures while training medical students in experimental techniques. Yet even these systematic atrocities were overshadowed by medicine's casual embrace of substances that were, quite literally, poisons disguised as cures. Medieval pharmacology reads like a handbook of systematic poisoning, where the most dangerous substances known to humanity were prescribed as everyday medicines. In an age where the line between poison and cure was drawn by superstition rather than science, patients found themselves consuming lethal toxins in the sincere belief that they were taking medicine. The medieval physician's cabinet was a collection of substances that would horrify modern toxicologists, administered in doses that routinely killed patients before their original ailments ever could. The foundation of medieval toxic medicine rested on the ancient principle that like cures like, and the belief that the most powerful poisons could become the most effective medicines when properly administered. This led to the systematic use of mercury, lead, arsenic, and dozens of other deadly substances as routine treatments for common ailments. What makes this particularly horrifying is that many of these substances were known to be lethal. Their toxicity wasn't a secret, but was considered proof of their medical potency. Mercury, known to medieval physicians as quicksilver, was perhaps the most widely prescribed poison in the medieval medical arsenal. This liquid metal, which we now know causes severe neurological damage, organ failure, and death, was considered a miracle cure for everything from skin diseases to mental illness. Patients with syphilis were subjected to mercury treatments that were often more devastating than the disease itself, developing the characteristic tremors, personality changes, and cognitive decline that physicians interpreted as signs that the treatment was working. The administration of mercury was a prolonged torture in itself. Patients would be placed in sealed chambers filled with mercury vapor, forced to inhale the toxic fumes for hours or days. Others would have mercury compounds rubbed directly into their skin, or have liquid mercury inserted into body cavities. The resulting mercury poisoning would cause victims to salivate uncontrollably, lose their teeth, develop severe tremors, and experience hallucinations and personality changes that physicians attributed to the expulsion of disease rather than toxic poisoning. Lead, another favorite of medieval physicians, was prescribed in various forms for treating everything from headaches to digestive problems. Lead pipes, lead-glazed pottery, and direct consumption of lead compounds created a constant background of lead poisoning among the medieval population. But physicians actually prescribed additional lead as medicine. Lead sugar, a particularly toxic lead compound with a sweet taste, was commonly given to children and pregnant women, causing devastating developmental problems and maternal deaths that were attributed to other causes. Arsenic, the classic poison of murder mysteries, was a routine prescription in medieval medicine, available in various forms: white arsenic, red arsenic, and various arsenic compounds. It was prescribed for skin conditions, digestive problems, and as a general tonic. Physicians believed that arsenic would burn away disease from within the body, not realizing that it was burning away the patients themselves. The characteristic symptoms of arsenic poisoning, nausea, vomiting, severe abdominal pain, and organ failure, were interpreted as evidence that the medicine was purging disease from the patient's system. The plant kingdom provided even more exotic forms of medicinal poison. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was commonly prescribed for various ailments despite its well-known lethal properties. The plant's name literally means beautiful woman, referring to its use by medieval ladies to dilate their pupils for cosmetic effect. But physicians prescribed it for treating everything from headaches to respiratory problems. The hallucinations, delirium, and respiratory failure caused by belladonna poisoning were often interpreted as spiritual experiences or evidence of the medicine's power to drive out evil spirits. Hemlock, the poison that killed Socrates, found regular use in medieval medicine as a treatment for pain and various nervous conditions. Physicians would carefully calculate doses intended to provide pain relief without causing death, but their understanding of dosage was primitive at best. Many patients who received hemlock treatment experienced the characteristic progressive paralysis and respiratory failure that marked hemlock poisoning, dying in agony, while their physicians believed they were witnessing a particularly dramatic cure. Henbane, another member of the deadly nightshade family, was prescribed for insomnia, pain, and various mental conditions. The plant's active compounds cause hallucinations, delirium, and potentially fatal respiratory depression, symptoms that medieval physicians interpreted as evidence of the medicine's power to alter consciousness and drive out mental illness. Patients treated with henbane would experience terrifying hallucinations and altered states of consciousness that often proved more traumatic than their original conditions. The preparation and administration of these toxic medicines was itself a form of systematic poisoning. Medieval physicians would combine multiple toxic substances in single prescriptions, creating cocktails of poisons that had unpredictable and often synergistic toxic effects. A patient might receive a prescription containing mercury, arsenic, and various poisonous plants, creating a toxic mixture that would overwhelm multiple organ systems simultaneously. Dosage calculations were based on mystical principles rather than medical evidence. Physicians would prescribe toxic substances according to astrological charts, phases of the moon, and various numerological systems that had nothing to do with safe or effective dosing. This led to wildly inconsistent and often lethal doses being administered to patients who had no way of knowing they were being systematically poisoned. The symptoms of chronic poisoning were often misinterpreted as signs of improvement or evidence that the medicine was working. Mercury poisoning symptoms like tremors and personality changes were seen as the expulsion of mental illness. Lead poisoning symptoms like abdominal pain and neurological problems were interpreted as the body purging itself of disease. Arsenic poisoning symptoms were viewed as evidence that the medicine was burning away corruption from within. Children were particularly vulnerable to toxic medicine prescriptions. Pediatric doses were often calculated as simple fractions of adult doses, without any understanding of how toxic substances affected developing bodies differently. Infants and young children would be given proportional doses of mercury, lead, and arsenic that were often immediately lethal. Those who survived often suffered permanent developmental damage that was attributed to their original illness rather than the toxic treatment. Pregnant women received some of the most dangerous toxic prescriptions. Mercury and lead compounds were commonly prescribed for pregnancy-related complaints, causing miscarriages, birth defects, and maternal deaths that were attributed to complications of pregnancy rather than toxic poisoning. The practice of prescribing toxic substances to pregnant women created generations of children born with neurological damage and developmental problems. The preparation of toxic medicines often involved additional dangerous practices. Physicians would heat mercury to create vapors, dissolve arsenic in wine, and create various combinations of toxic substances that multiplied their dangerous effects. The preparation process itself often exposed physicians and their assistants to toxic substances, creating occupational poisoning among medical practitioners. Some of the most horrifying toxic prescriptions involved the use of radioactive substances, though medieval physicians had no understanding of radioactivity. Certain mineral preparations contained naturally occurring radioactive elements that caused radiation poisoning symptoms that were interpreted as evidence of the medicine's power. Patients would develop radiation sickness while their physicians prescribed additional doses of the same radioactive substances. The psychological effects of toxic medicine were as devastating as the physical effects. Patients who survived toxic treatments often developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress from their poisoning experiences. The hallucinations, delirium, and altered consciousness caused by toxic medicines created lasting psychological trauma that physicians would then treat with additional toxic substances. The social impact of widespread toxic medicine was enormous. Entire communities would suffer from the effects of prescribed poisoning, with high rates of neurological problems, developmental disabilities, and mysterious deaths that were attributed to various diseases rather than medical poisoning. The cumulative effect was a population that was systematically weakened and damaged by the very medical system intended to heal them. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of medieval toxic medicine was the genuine faith that both physicians and patients placed in these deadly substances. Families would spend their life savings on medicines that were slowly killing their loved ones, while physicians prescribed increasingly dangerous combinations of toxins in the sincere belief that they were providing the best possible care. As devastating as these toxic prescriptions were, they pale in comparison to the systematic brutalization of the most vulnerable members of medieval society. In the hierarchy of medieval medical horror, no group suffered more systematically or completely than those least able to defend themselves. Women, children, and the mentally ill. These vulnerable populations became the primary targets for the most experimental, dangerous, and brutal medical procedures. Their suffering amplified by social attitudes that viewed them as inherently flawed, dangerous, or disposable. The treatment of these groups reveals medieval medicine at its absolute worst, where prejudice and ignorance combined to create systematic campaigns of medical torture against society's most defenseless members. Women in medieval society were considered medically inferior by design, their bodies viewed as fundamentally flawed versions of male anatomy. This belief system, inherited from ancient Greek medical texts and reinforced by religious doctrine, created a medical approach to women that was both systematically brutal and specifically targeted at their reproductive functions. Medieval physicians believed that women's bodies were inherently unstable, prone to corruption, and in constant need of aggressive medical intervention to maintain even basic health. The medieval understanding of female anatomy was so distorted that it justified the most horrific medical procedures. Physicians believed that the uterus was a mobile organ that could wander throughout the body, causing various ailments wherever it settled. This condition, known as hysteria, was treated through procedures designed to force the wandering womb back into its proper position. These treatments included the insertion of foul-smelling substances into the vagina to repel the uterus, the application of pleasant scents to the nose to attract it back upward, and direct manipulation through instruments inserted into the body. The treatment of hysteria involved some of the most brutal procedures in medieval medicine. Women diagnosed with this condition, which could include anything from emotional distress to physical illness, were subjected to violent pelvic manipulations, the insertion of various instruments into their reproductive organs, and systematic beating of the abdominal area to encourage the uterus to return to its proper position. These procedures were performed without anesthesia and often resulted in severe internal injuries, infections, and death. Childbirth became an opportunity for medical experimentation that treated women as expendable test subjects. Medieval physicians viewed pregnancy and labor as pathological conditions requiring aggressive medical intervention. Women in labor were subjected to procedures that had never been tested, including experimental cesarean sections performed without proper surgical knowledge, the use of various instruments to forcibly extract infants, and the administration of toxic substances intended to speed or ease labor. The medieval cesarean section was essentially a death sentence disguised as medical care, performed without sterile technique, effective anesthesia, or proper surgical knowledge. These procedures had mortality rates approaching 100%, yet physicians continued to perform them, using women's bodies as training grounds for surgical techniques and anatomical exploration. The women who underwent these procedures were essentially sacrificed to medical curiosity. Gynecological examinations in medieval times were exercises in systematic torture. The instruments used for these examinations were often indistinguishable from torture devices, featuring sharp edges, crushing mechanisms, and expanding components that would cause maximum trauma to delicate tissues. Women were routinely subjected to internal examinations that were more exploratory surgery than medical assessment, with physicians using these opportunities to test theories about female anatomy and reproductive function. The treatment of menstruation reveals the depth of medieval misogyny disguised as medical science. Menstrual blood was considered toxic and corrupting, requiring aggressive medical intervention to prevent it from poisoning the woman's entire system. Women were subjected to bloodletting, purging, and various forms of internal cleansing during their menstrual periods, procedures that often caused more harm than the natural biological process they were intended to treat. Breast diseases provided another avenue for systematic brutalization of women. Medieval physicians believed that many female ailments originated in the breasts and could be cured through aggressive manipulation or partial removal of breast tissue. Women with breast lumps, pain, or other conditions were subjected to procedures involving the systematic crushing, burning, or surgical removal of breast tissue, often leaving them permanently disfigured and frequently causing fatal infections. The treatment of mental illness in women was particularly brutal, as physicians combined their ignorance of mental health with their prejudices about female nature. Women displaying any form of emotional distress, independence, or nonconformity were labeled as mentally ill and subjected to treatments designed to break their spirit and restore their supposed natural submissiveness. These treatments included prolonged restraint, systematic beating, starvation, and various forms of psychological torture disguised as medical therapy. Children suffered even more completely under medieval medical practices, as they were considered miniature adults with no special needs or considerations. Pediatric medicine was simply adult medicine applied to smaller bodies, with no understanding of developmental differences or appropriate dosing for children. This approach resulted in systematic poisoning, surgical trauma, and psychological abuse that permanently damaged those fortunate enough to survive. Infant mortality rates under medieval medical care were catastrophic, with medical intervention often proving more deadly than the diseases it purported to treat. Newborns were subjected to the same toxic medications, brutal surgical procedures, and aggressive treatments as adults. Their tiny bodies overwhelmed by interventions that would challenge adult survivors. The casual acceptance of infant death as a result of medical treatment reveals the complete absence of any concept of appropriate pediatric care. Childhood diseases were treated with an aggressive brutality that reflected medieval medicine's belief that illness required violent intervention to be cured. Children with fevers were subjected to bloodletting that would drain significant portions of their total blood volume. Those with digestive problems received powerful purgatives that caused severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. Respiratory illnesses were treated with cauterization of the chest and throat, procedures that often caused more respiratory distress than the original condition. The treatment of childhood behavioral problems reveals medieval medicine's complete misunderstanding of child development and psychology. Children who displayed what we would now recognize as normal developmental behaviors, curiosity, energy, emotional expression, were often diagnosed with various forms of madness and subjected to treatments designed to break their spirit and enforce absolute compliance. These treatments included physical restraint, sensory deprivation, systematic beating, and various forms of psychological torture. Educational institutions, particularly those training future physicians, used vulnerable populations as teaching materials for medical students. Orphans, prisoners, and the mentally ill became unwilling demonstration subjects for anatomy lessons, surgical training, and experimental procedures. These individuals were treated as disposable resources for medical education, with no consideration for their suffering or survival. The mentally ill faced perhaps the most systematic brutalization of any group in medieval society. Mental illness was viewed as evidence of moral corruption, demonic possession, or divine punishment, justifying the most extreme medical interventions. Patients with mental health conditions were subjected to systematic torture disguised as treatment, including prolonged restraint, sensory deprivation, starvation, and various forms of physical and psychological abuse designed to drive out the evil spirits supposedly causing their condition. The treatment of epilepsy exemplifies the brutal approach to mental and neurological conditions. Epileptic patients were subjected to trepanation, cauterization, systematic beating during seizures, and the administration of toxic substances intended to prevent future episodes. The stress and trauma of these treatments often made seizures worse, leading to even more aggressive interventions in a cycle of escalating medical torture. Elderly patients, particularly those without family support, became targets for experimental procedures and training exercises. Their advanced age and often limited life expectancy made them ideal subjects for testing new treatments and surgical techniques. Many elderly patients who sought medical care for minor ailments found themselves subjected to experimental procedures that hastened their deaths, while providing training opportunities for physicians. The most vulnerable members of society, orphans, prisoners, the homeless, and those with mental illness, were routinely used as test subjects for the most dangerous experimental procedures. These individuals had no advocates, no legal protections, and no means of refusing medical treatment, making them perfect subjects for physicians eager to test new theories and techniques without regard for patient safety or consent. Perhaps most disturbing was the systematic nature of this abuse. The brutalization of vulnerable populations wasn't the result of individual physician cruelty, but was built into the very structure of medieval medical practice. Medical texts routinely recommended different, more aggressive treatments for women, children, and other vulnerable groups, reflecting social attitudes that viewed these populations as inherently less valuable and more expendable. Yet even as we confront these systematic horrors, we must remember that medieval physicians believed they were providing compassionate care according to the best medical knowledge available. This makes their legacy even more chilling, as it reminds us how easily good intentions can become instruments of systematic suffering when not guided by scientific rigor and ethical constraints. But our journey through medieval medical horror has one final stop: the lasting impact of these practices on our understanding of medicine, healing, and the sacred trust between physician and patient. As we reach the end of our journey through the darkest chapters of medical history, we must confront a truth that resonates across the centuries. The medieval period's medical practices were not aberrations or exceptions, but logical extensions of a system built on superstition, social prejudice, and the complete absence of scientific rigor. The suffering we've witnessed tonight, the bloodletting, trepanation, toxic prescriptions, and systematic torture of the vulnerable, represents more than historical curiosity. It stands as a stark reminder of what medicine becomes when it abandons evidence for ideology, when it prioritizes theory over humanity, and when it fails to recognize the sacred trust inherent in the healing relationship. The transformation from medieval medical torture to modern scientific medicine didn't happen overnight, nor was it a simple progression from ignorance to knowledge. The path forward was marked by countless setbacks, bitter resistance from established medical authorities, and the continued suffering of patients who became unwilling participants in medicine's gradual awakening to scientific principles. Understanding this legacy helps us appreciate not just how far we've come, but how fragile the foundations of ethical medical practice truly are. The end of bloodletting provides a perfect example of how slowly medical progress could advance, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Despite mounting proof of its dangers, bloodletting continued to be practiced well into the 19th century. George Washington's death in 1799, almost certainly caused by aggressive bloodletting, should have served as a wake-up call to the medical community. Instead, physicians continued to drain patients' blood for decades afterward, demonstrating the powerful hold that tradition and authority could maintain over medical practice. The abandonment of trepanation as a routine treatment followed a similar pattern, even as understanding of brain anatomy improved and surgical techniques advanced. physicians continued to drill holes in skulls for conditions that we now know have nothing to do with intracranial pressure. The transition away from trepanation required not just better scientific knowledge, but a fundamental shift in how physicians understood the relationship between physical intervention and healing. Perhaps most importantly, the legacy of medieval medical practices teaches us about the crucial role of patient advocacy and informed consent in modern medicine. The systematic abuse of vulnerable populations, women, children, the mentally ill, and the poor, was possible only because these groups had no voice in their treatment decisions and no legal protections from medical experimentation. The development of patient rights, informed consent procedures, and ethical oversight represents one of the most significant advances in the history of medicine. The establishment of medical ethics as a formal discipline grew directly from recognition of the horrors that could result from unrestrained medical practice. The Hippocratic Oath's injunction to, first, do no harm, takes on new meaning when we understand how completely medieval medicine abandoned this principle in pursuit of theoretical cures and experimental procedures. Modern medical ethics, with its emphasis on patient autonomy, beneficence, and justice, represents a direct response to the systematic dehumanization that characterized medieval medical practice. The development of evidence-based medicine, the requirement that medical treatments be proven safe and effective through rigorous testing, stands as perhaps the most important legacy of medieval medical failures. The casual acceptance of unproven treatments, the reliance on ancient authorities rather than observed evidence, and the systematic poisoning of patients with toxic substances all contributed to the eventual recognition that medical practice must be grounded in scientific evidence rather than tradition or theory. Modern medical education reflects lessons learned from medieval medical horrors. The emphasis on anatomy, physiology, and pharmacology as foundational sciences ensures that physicians understand how the human body actually functions rather than relying on mythical theories about wandering organs or imbalanced humors. Clinical training that emphasizes patient interaction, careful observation, and systematic evaluation represents a complete reversal of medieval practices that treated patients as passive subjects for theoretical interventions. The regulation of medical practice through licensing, oversight, and professional standards grew from recognition that the power to heal carries with it the potential for enormous harm. Medieval physicians operated without oversight, accountability, or standardized training, creating an environment where individual prejudices and theoretical obsessions could translate directly into patient suffering. Modern medical regulation, while imperfect, represents a systematic attempt to prevent the kinds of abuses that characterized medieval practice. The development of anesthesia and pain management as medical specialties reflects a fundamental shift in how medicine views patient suffering. Medieval physicians not only tolerated patient pain, but often viewed it as beneficial, evidence that their treatments were working. Modern medicine's commitment to minimizing suffering, even when necessary procedures must be performed, represents a complete reversal of medieval attitudes toward pain and healing. Perhaps most significantly, the legacy of medieval medical practices reminds us that the relationship between physician and patient is built on trust that can be easily betrayed. The patients who underwent bloodletting, trepanation, and toxic treatments trusted their physicians to help them, just as patients today trust their doctors to provide safe and effective care. Understanding how completely this trust was betrayed in the past helps us appreciate the enormous responsibility that modern physicians carry. The story of medieval medicine also teaches us about the dangers of medical orthodoxy and the importance of questioning established practices. Many of the most harmful medieval treatments persisted not because they were effective, but because they were traditional, authoritative, and unquestioned. The willingness to challenge medical orthodoxy, to demand evidence for medical practices, and to prioritize patient welfare over professional tradition represents one of the most important developments in medical history. The technological advances that characterize modern medicine, from diagnostic imaging to minimally invasive surgery, represent more than just technical progress. They reflect a fundamental commitment to understanding the human body as it actually exists, rather than as ancient theories suggested it should exist. The precision and care with which modern medical procedures are performed stands in stark contrast to the brutal approximations that characterized medieval practice. Yet perhaps the most important lesson from medieval medical practices is that the potential for healing and the potential for harm are inextricably linked. Every medical intervention carries risks, and the history of medicine is marked by treatments that later proved harmful despite good intentions. The recognition that medical practice must be constantly evaluated, constantly improved, and constantly guided by evidence represents the most important legacy of medieval medical failures. The transformation of medicine from a system of systematic torture to a science of healing represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. Yet this transformation was built on the suffering of countless individuals who trusted physicians to help them, and instead became victims of medical ignorance and prejudice. Their suffering was not meaningless if it teaches us to never again allow medical practice to stray so far from its fundamental commitment to healing. As we reflect on this dark period in medical history, we must remember that the physicians who practiced bloodletting, trepanation, and systematic poisoning were not monsters. They were products of their time, working within systems of knowledge and belief that led them to practices we now recognize as horrific. This recognition should inspire both gratitude for the progress we've made and humility about our current medical practices, which future generations may view with equal horror. The story of medieval medical practices ultimately teaches us that the practice of medicine is not just a technical discipline, but a moral one. The power to heal carries with it the responsibility to ensure that healing remains the primary goal, that patient welfare takes precedence over theoretical considerations, and that the trust inherent in the physician-patient relationship is never betrayed. Tonight, as you rest in the comfort of modern medical care, remember the countless individuals who suffered under medieval medical practices. Their pain was not in vain if it contributed to the eventual development of a medical system that truly serves human welfare. Their legacy lives on in every medical advancement that prioritizes patient safety, every ethical guideline that protects vulnerable populations, and every physician who remembers that healing, not harm, must always be medicine's ultimate goal. The journey from medieval medical torture to modern scientific medicine reminds us that progress is possible, that human suffering can lead to human wisdom, and that the commitment to healing, real healing, based on evidence, guided by ethics, and motivated by compassion, represents one of humanity's most noble aspirations. But this legacy also carries a warning: the potential for medical practice to become divorced from healing, to prioritize theory over humanity, and to betray the trust of those who seek help. remains as real today as it was in medieval times. The price of ethical medical practice is eternal vigilance, constant questioning, and an unwavering commitment to the principle that those who seek healing deserve our best efforts to help, not harm. The medieval period's medical practices may seem like ancient history, but their lessons remain urgently relevant. In an age of rapidly advancing medical technology, increasing specialization, and complex healthcare systems, the fundamental principles learned from medieval medical failures, the importance of evidence-based practice, ethical oversight, patient advocacy, and the primacy of healing over theoretical considerations become more important than ever. The suffering we've witnessed tonight was real, and it mattered. It mattered to the individuals who endured it, to their families who watched helplessly, and to the eventual development of a medical system worthy of the trust patients place in it. By remembering their suffering, by learning from their sacrifice, and by committing ourselves to never again allowing medical practice to stray so far from its healing mission, we honor their memory and help ensure that the dark ages of medicine remain permanently in the past.